My name is Ambrose Conroy. I'm the founder and CEO at Seraph. I'm joined by Wade Phillips, who's president of Seraph Europe. Seraph regularly produces these reports, and we trust that you find them of value. Some of our clients and industry partners who regularly attend these calls, these webinars, will note that Thomas Kowal is no longer with us. I wanted to take a moment to thank him for his contributions and wish him well in his future endeavors. Today's report is particularly important due to the recent Biden administration tariffs on China, and particularly the Chinese automotive industry. These tariffs are similar to those that we expected from the Trump administration, and we'll address some real issues and discuss ways that we can improve responses to tariffs and to other issues as we move forward. We're also going to cover larger issues beyond our control, including economic issues, infrastructure, and geopolitical topics. These are things that are impactful to your organization, and we want our clients to be prepared as you develop your plans and your strategies moving forward. We'll also take questions at the end, but the Q&A will be open the whole meeting on Teams, and we'll respond to any comments on LinkedIn during or after the call. We look forward to speaking with many of you following up on this and to a good webinar. So let's begin. Wade, why don't you start us off?
Thanks, Ambrose. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about here. So the structure of the webinar and the presentation, or the report that we'll put out this time, is this. And they're a little bit different, the agenda items, than they've been in the past. So we'll talk a little bit about volumes and financials. So volumes and financials are somewhat tied, but we'll talk about some of the supplier distress we're seeing from a financial perspective and what that's causing in the industry. OEM strategy and EV adoption. We went in a few years ago all in on EVs, and I think in a few reports ago, we mentioned not so fast. The pendulum seems to be swinging back the other way, and it's continuing to do that. And we'll talk some more about that. Supplier outlook and what the impact of those things are on the supply base and the OEMs to some extent. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about adapting to the road ahead. And we say a lot that it's not good enough just to say, here's all the things that are wrong, or here's all the problems. We really owe it, at least our practice believes we owe it to the industry to say, okay, so what do we do about it?
Yeah. We've talked to a lot of you. We've gotten a lot of views from industry leaders, and there are a lot of things that stuck out to us based on multiple conversations. We've heard significant amounts about the election in the U.S. and Mexico. There's a lot of uncertainty around the elections, and that's creating volatility, and we're not quite sure what to do with that. Plans and strategies are being set up to have contingencies. We're seeing volatile customer demand, especially due to the EV transition. We're seeing different powertrains being a focus as we move forward. There's more focus being put back on ICE, and there's hybrids coming into play. People are really beginning to look more seriously at hybrids as a bridge between ICE and EV. We're seeing risks and rising costs, inflation, persistent inflation. And persistent inflation is really giving us challenges. We were hoping to have lower interest rates. We were hoping inflation would go down, but we're seeing that rising, which is really challenging what we're doing. And then we saw even before Tuesday, concern about Chinese manufacturing. China was coming up in conversations, and we were hoping for cost savings. We were seeing it as a way to go. I see something different happening. I see a new economic Cold War with China emerging. I grew up with the Soviet Union being a concern. We talked about it. There were media and movies all around what was going to happen with the Cold War with Russia. And it was much more about what would happen from a violence perspective. Here, it's really an economic action. The initial tariffs that we've seen being placed on China by the Biden administration are really a warning shot across the bow. They're not going to interfere with current production, but they're designed, it appears, to protect U.S. industry. So if we look at how that impacts automotive, we're seeing that 102% tariff on cars. That really won't have much impact. There are a few OEMs that are shipping cars in from China right now, but it's really a preventative measure. The 25% tariff on steel, aluminum, and critical minerals isn't going to have a significant impact right now. It'll have minor impacts. The 50% impact on semiconductors could be more meaningful. And the real thing that we see is the impact of the tariffs on batteries. So battery tariff of 25% will have an impact on a lot of you out there. And that could put a damper on EV adoption even further than we see. So it's clear that this initial announcement coming from the Biden administration was a first shot across the bow, and we expect more to come. We expect to see tariffs come in from the Biden administration very quickly, which could impact automotive components. So a lot of our clients out there, a lot of the suppliers are sourcing from China right now, and we need to think about what would happen if we got a 60% tariff on day one, a blanket tariff across all the automotive parts.
Yeah, I think that's going to be significant, right? Because Trump has said if he comes back into the White House on day one, he's going to install a 60% Seraph across the board.
Yeah, that tariff across the board would be very impactful.
And that would be pretty impactful. Now, that's all obviously Biden administration in North America, or the United States, I should say. In Europe, they are also discussing significant tariffs on Chinese goods. Certainly not drastic to the point of 2.5% on EVs, but they are talking in the neighborhood of 30 to 35%, those kind of things. So I fully expect that we'll see in Europe follow on to this. It won't be quite as drastic, but we'll see some continued escalation.
And there's a tripling of roll-on, roll-off ships being deployed in China. So as those come on board next year, China has the ability to flood the European market. So I think tariffs should be expected there. So we're going to talk about volumes and financials. So volumes are really interesting. They're still down 8% from pre-COVID levels. They're down 8% in Europe, and they're down 8% in the U.S. To me, that's pretty interesting. It's impacting supply base. We had some capacity here. We've still got a lot of capacity in China that's coming online. So we've got real struggles and challenges. And the EVs that we were all expecting to come in and replace cars, it hasn't happened. People are still holding onto their cars longer. If we look at what's going on, we've got ICE, we've got hybrid, we've got EVs coming into place, but the price of cars has gone up a lot. The average price of passenger cars is significantly higher, and the age of cars is increasing. So we're seeing a 15% increase in the age of cars in the U.S. and a 17% increase of the age of cars in Europe. And when I was growing up as a kid, my father always wanted to get 100,000 miles out of a car, and he focused on that. I remember going with him to buy a car when I was really young, and they were pitching Z-Bar, they were pitching rust protection. How do you keep this car on the road for a long time? And in Chicago, you had to do things because the salt and the snow and the ice really ate away at the car. There was a recent Wall Street Journal article, and this is one that I found really interesting, and I think a lot of you probably saw it, talking about cars going 200,000 miles. And that's really where they are now, where we're pushing this life of a car much further than we did at any time in the past. So arguably, we've done a good job, maybe too good a job, with quality and reliability of cars. When we look at what's going on in the market right now, we've seen a recovery in inventories. Inventories are up in the U.S., and the U.S. really is a different model than Europe has, Wade. We build cars to stock, and in Europe, I hear more about those cars. Yeah, much less. They're built to order. People want to choose what's in their car. The thing that I find very interesting in the U.S. is the car price. If we look at from 2019, the average transaction price of a car is up about $10,000. That's really significant. Car prices are up 30%. CPI is up 23%. We're seeing a lot of pressure on people. They can't afford to buy these cars. So that's pretty impactful. And it's big numbers in terms of price increases. It's big numbers in terms of CPI. But the fact that all of these things are going up, consumers are really feeling a squeeze.
And a lot of that, I believe, on this chart punctuates some of the age as well, right? Because absolutely agree with you that quality obviously going to the 10-year, 150,000-mile reliability testing and some of the things that the industry has improved over the past, 20 years. Certainly, quality and reliability in vehicles is substantially higher than it was when you were a kid or when I was a kid. But in addition to that, you've got higher interest rates, longer financing terms. I've seen as long as 84 months to finance a car. Prices being literally 30% up from where they were, say, pre-pandemic, is all recipe for holding on to your car longer.
Absolutely is. And OEMs want to keep prices up. They want those margins. There's a real fight right now to maintain the margins, and that's impacting things.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that right now, actually. Globally, suppliers are in a very challenged position with decreasing margins. And actually, with those decreasing margins is a stranded EV CapEx because of the EV transition and capitalizing or investing in that. And then the volume's not necessarily coming to fruition, or the sales not necessarily coming to fruition. Since the pandemic, the margin dynamic has transposed where suppliers were advantaged prior to the pandemic, but the OEMs are since. So you can see on the chart on the left, prior to the big dip during the pandemic, the dark line was higher than the lighter line, which means the suppliers were advantaged from an EBIT margin perspective. But since the pandemic, that's transposed and diverged quite dramatically. OEMs have leveraged control to boost their profit margins at the expense of the suppliers, who are now obviously earning below their historical norms. And that imbalance is going to lead, in our opinion, to a lot of supplier bankruptcies and undue stress across the industry, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. So historically, many believe that investments in certain suppliers, such as those for ICE vehicles, were now unnecessary because of the EV transition. And underinvestment in that ICE capital has led to outdated production lines, people not keeping up with those production lines because eventually they're going to die a natural death as we transition to EV in products, and those production lines now urgently requiring modernization.
And not just modernization, we need to increase capacity in some of them. There's really an investment that's going on there, and no one has the capital right now to make those investments. So there's a battle for figuring out how we get that capital to come to play.
Yeah, absolutely. So think about it. Not that long ago, the governments were saying, hey, by 2030 or now 2035 in some cases, we're not going to have ICE vehicles anymore. So, of course, the OEMs say, okay, we hear you, and they start investing in EV. The suppliers start investing in EV. Some of that capacity from ICE is now gone. So you have to reinvest in that capacity, and the capacity that remains has to be invested into to modernize and keep back up with it. So in essence, it's a bill that's long deferred, is coming due, and it promises to be costly for OEMs, because you can see that the OEMs are the ones that are making the margins at this point. And by the way, that's much stronger, 2024, that's much stronger in Europe than it is the U.S., or North America, I should say. In the distance between the dark and light lines in Europe is wider. We have the pressure from China. So China currently has the capacity for half of the world's cars, and they're not fully utilizing it. So their untapped capacity means that they could flood the market with low-cost parts and vehicles, intensifying competition, especially in Europe, given the recent tariff announcements. So we believe that pressure is a key reason to those deteriorating margins, and as we lower prices to compete with China parts and keep our plants operational.
And purchasing here has really played a role. We've been sourcing from China, and China's become the manufacturer of record. And as we look more at China for that, it's just put strains on a lot of companies here. We're seeing negative EBITDA margins for the first quarter with U.S.-based supplier, and the European suppliers are still making a profit, which is why this shows there's some numbers there. But that's a lot of stress on a lot of things. The dynamic really has changed, and the fact that the U.S. tariffs have come in play to prevent Chinese cars from coming in is going to put even more pressure on Europe.
That's right. And obviously the landscape changes with the U.S. Tariffs that were announced this week, and then in Europe thinking about it, they're a little bit later, but they're going to have to do something. I think what was announced this week is really only the first step. And with all those pressures, obviously the relationships between suppliers and OEMs is inevitably becoming more contentious, even to the point of litigation. A lot more litigation, I think we're seeing. So we have with us today on the call here Adam Ratliff of Warner, Norcross and Judd, a local Michigan area law firm, who's going to talk a little bit about that. Adam, what kind of situations are you seeing at your firm?
Yeah, thanks, Wade. And everything that you were just talking about is a lot of what we're hearing from our supplier clients as to the different pressures that have led to our office getting called. My name is Adam Ratliff. I'm a partner at Warner, Norcross and Judd. I focus my practice on the automotive supply chain, and in particular, all manner of disputes amongst suppliers and their customers. And that means, for all the reasons we've been discussing this morning and over the last couple of years, it's been a busy couple of months, busy couple of years. But as you can see on this slide, this is just a sampling of an influx in recent disputes and disputes that boil over to the point of litigation. And so what I wanted to discuss with the few minutes we've got this morning is I really think that this present moment of heightened tensions, if you will, heightened litigation, increased risk of litigation is and can be explained generally by two things. So the first is the first case that we see listed on this sheet here, which is the MSSC versus Airbus case. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners this morning might have heard of this case, might be familiar with it, might have even read the case. It was a decision last July from the Michigan Supreme Court in an automotive supply chain case. And I won't go into the details here, but I think that the takeaway for the purposes of our conversation this morning is that the case reaffirmed a bedrock principle that we have in the law, in legal contracting and supply chain contracting, which is mutuality, meaning that if a supplier is bound to supply its customer's requirements, that under the law, that means that the customer also has to be required to purchase its requirements from the supplier. And this wasn't a new concept. This has been the law in Michigan and around the country for decades. But the case that provided much needed clarity on this point. And I can say much needed clarity because myself and a few of my colleagues were fortunate enough to be able to represent Airbus in this case. And so this is the argument we made to the Michigan Supreme Court, which is there had been a growing trend among large OEM and tier one and even down the supply chain terms and conditions that we're starting to give buyers sort of unilateral ordering flexibility. And that was really at odds with this principle of mutuality. And so that's the kind of the disjointedness that the decision last July solved. And it said, no, you can't do that, buyers. You can't have unilateral flexibility to order or not order from your suppliers, but then also still try to force your suppliers to supply you. If you want your suppliers to be bound to continue supplying you long-term, you have to commit to your suppliers long-term. And because there were all these terms and conditions that are out there that weren't set up that way, after the Airbus decision comes out, suppliers are equipped with this additional legal leverage ammunition to use in negotiations and disputes with their customers. And we've seen an influx of what could be shorthand and what I've seen shorthand called Airbus arguments in the last year since this decision. So that's one thing that's happening. And on the other side of it, you have the customer fatigue and pushback. First of all, there is a fatigue from seeing these arguments from the suppliers that the contracts aren't enforceable, or that the supplier can suspend shipments to get a price increase. I'm starting to see some real fatigue from those arguments, as especially the larger tier ones and OEMs see these arguments over and over. And then the other thing that I think is starting to wear on customers are, when we were post-COVID, those first couple of years, 21 and 22, and the supply chain was trying to start to return to normal. Inflation was at its peak back then. Raw material costs, largely as a result of COVID and supply chain strains, had exploded. And there were a lot of efforts from the supply chain to pass those costs up. And for some period of time, that was largely being accepted by the OEMs, by the top of the supply chain, and there was cost relief coming down. What we've seen in the last year or so is the OEMs and then the large customers saying no a lot more often. So you have really these two things that I think are coming to a head right now. You have emboldened suppliers who have this new piece of legal leverage in their negotiations, and you have fatigued customers who are tired of seeing these arguments, who are tired of writing annual inflation recovery checks that reach in the 6-7 figures to numerous suppliers. And that's really coming to a head. It's boiled over into increased disputes and increased litigation. This slide is really just a sampling. It's a couple of the highest profile cases we've seen, but there are dozens and dozens of these cases being litigated right now in Michigan courts and federal courts and even around the country. We're seeing new members of the supply chain initiate these cases. And as you can see, just in this sampling, 3 of these cases that we highlighted are by an OEM customer suing its supplier, which is something that prior to this year was extraordinarily rare. And here it's popped up already several times. The other thing that's happening in all 5 of these cases and many other cases is all of these cases started as requests for an injunction. So a customer went into court and sought an emergency injunction to force its supplier to continue shipping. In some of these cases, the customer got it, and in some they didn't. And in this moment, I really think, and I'll conclude with, I think there's kind of 2 takeaways that our supply chain participants can keep in mind in this kind of moment of heightened tension. One is, I think right now it's more critical than ever to be aware of what your legal leverage. There's a sort of an increased legal literacy in the supply chain right now, and no one wants to end up in litigation. No one wants their dispute or their negotiation with their customer or supplier to end up in front of a judge. But right now, I think there's a heightened risk of that. And so if you don't know what your legal leverage is, what your legal vulnerabilities are, you're already a step behind in the negotiation. And the other thing I'd leave us with is part of that, you need to continue to watch the legal space. So we had the big notable decision in the Airbus case last year, but all these other cases are still pending. And there will continue to be impactful decisions from state court, federal court on these issues, on supply chain issues. And the sophisticated members of the supply chain are watching those decisions and are reacting accordingly. We're already seeing that. And so that's, again, if that's not something that you're watching, that you're paying attention to, you're potentially falling behind. So I'll stop there today. This is what I do all day, every day, and my colleagues do all day, every day. And so we're happy to discuss further offline. Feel free to give us a call. But it's been certainly a busy time. Our phones have been ringing a lot due to all these issues. So with that, I'll hand it back to Wade.
Thanks, Adam. And for those that want to get a hold of Adam for any additional information and that kind of thing, we'll have his contact information toward the end of this presentation when we send it out to everybody that's on the call. So because of those depressed margins for suppliers, the debt picture is getting worse as well. OEMs on average have been able, on average, some are obviously performing better than others, but on average have maintained their liquid assets, reduced their debt to equity ratio, and can manage their debt, as evidenced by the lighter colored kind of gold line on the three charts. But the suppliers is a different story due to the past few years of depressed margins, but continuing to have to invest. And with the kind of uncertainty in powertrain with regard to EV, ICE, hybrid, so on and so forth, investment has to continue. And so they're spending their cash, taking on debt, and their ability to cover that debt is getting worse every year since the pandemic. And based on those depressed margins and that debt picture, it's no surprise the smallest of the suppliers are the ones that are going to be affected first. We can't say that medium and large suppliers are healthy in all cases, but certainly on the average, they're in less danger than the small ones, which I think stands to reason.
And the disputes that we're seeing, a lot of those were smaller suppliers, but some of them were significant ones.
Yeah, some of them, Yangfeng, a little bit larger, but some of those are smaller suppliers, as you would expect.
And the OEMs a lot of them are going back and saying, hey, we need money, we need support. It's an interesting environment, and we're going to see more of that based on what we're seeing here and debt ratings.
And so on average, suppliers have experienced depressed margins over the past few years. Debt is mounting. The ability to service that debt is getting more and more difficult to do. And our analysis shows that many won't be able to get any more debt due to low credit ratings. So you can see there on the right, 39% of OEMs and 68% of suppliers are below investment grade in credit rating. Not only is their debt mounting, and their ability to service it getting worse, they're going to struggle to get any more. Now, there is some private equity activity in the supply base, but it's not coming to save the industry, given the picture that's been painted over the past few slides.
And the PE firms that we've talked to are really holding off. They're waiting until we get to bankruptcy. They see their vultures waiting in the wings and circling. They don't want to put money to play right now because they don't know that it won't be good money that they're throwing at bad companies. They want to see good companies emerge from this. So we're forecasting some changes here. The OEMs are being forced in to subsidize a lot of these suppliers. They need to invest in their supply base. You can't build a car unless you have every single part. The whole focus of smaller commodity suppliers that bought the business, we're seeing them have the largest financial need here. And they're the ones that are the most distressed. The larger suppliers, though, that made really big EV investments, that bet on EV, that followed the mandates that the governments of the U.S. and the EU put out, are also really strained right now. There's a lot of losses and there's a lot of CapEx that's stranded. And China has this excess subsidized capacity, which purchasing departments have been using to hammer down suppliers. The challenge is we need all parts to build a car. And right now we don't have all those parts coming. So we're projecting, because of all this stress that's out there, an increased number of bankruptcies, not just in automotive, but across industry right now. Those bankruptcies are going to really put even more strain in the situation in the automotive network. And OEMs are going to have to continue to bail out the different suppliers that they have, subsidize them, and keep them going. So what we see really is we've got a new norm here. We've got significantly elevated prices. Prices are higher in both the U.S. and Europe. Sales volumes are down. People are holding on to their cars longer. We're fixing them. We're repairing them. It's driving a problem with service parts as well. We can't get service parts for all the cars. So you're going aftermarket, even aftermarket supply. Cars are sitting off-road a little bit longer. It's frustrating everyone in the industry. There are lower supplier margins. Suppliers are getting hammered by the OEMs who are trying to protect their profitability, and they're being squeezed by inflation, higher labor, and they're not able to get the productivity gains that were built into their contracts. The price givebacks aren't necessarily there, and balance sheets are severely impacted right now. We talked about more bankruptcies coming. There's a lot of CapEx that's stranded. All this EV investment, we're waiting for EVs to come. We're waiting for that to hit. So it's going to take a little bit of time for this to all shake out. Let's talk a little bit about OEM strategies and EV adoption. So we're seeing a shift here. This is one that I find really interesting. There was a huge mandate for EVs, and a lot of people that know me know I'm a big EV early adopter. So in 2012, I got a Tesla, and I've driven a Tesla since. We have an ICE vehicle as well, but I love an EV, and I live in California. I've got a home charger. We'll talk a little bit about charging and what really makes an EV work and what I see as the impediments preventing from consumers from adopting EVs. We've seen a shift to hybrids right now. Ford has added Maverick capacity. So the Maverick hybrid is something that consumers are looking at. We see Toyota really coming to play here. They're saying 45% of the product that they're going to sell this year is going to be hybrids. Toyota has constantly had that hybrid strategy. That's been their focus. They've leapfrogged past EVs. They're now finally starting to look at EVs. But if we look at hybrids more broadly, we see other OEMs starting to look at what Toyota has done successfully and enter the market. So in the US, we're seeing less market entrants, fewer market entrants. We've got Toyota. That's that yellow gold bar in the middle there. They've dominated it. They've got a good market share in there. Hyundai Kia has also played, and they play both in Europe and the US. They've introduced a bunch of hybrids. They're good quality hybrids. People like them. Ford has pushed hybrids out. And in Europe, we've got Renault Nissan putting hybrids out there. Others are starting to wake up, starting to come to the table. There was the massive investment in EVs, and everyone really followed what the governments wanted and pushed to EVs. But there are some hurdles that are really preventing EVs from getting adopted. Charging, I think, is one of the largest hurdles. So we've got two that I see as being big: cost and charging. As I said before, I've driven Teslas for quite a while. Teslas are a unique case. We've got a buy charging market, and we've got up here, you can see, we've seen chargers not increase nearly as quickly as cars have increased. We've got a 1 to 8 ratio back in 2011 in the US for chargers. Probably adequate at that point in time because people at that point had home chargers, and this doesn't include home chargers. These are chargers in the wild. But a lot of these are slow chargers, and we'll talk about the difference between chargers in a minute. And now it's 1 to 19, and that's really a tough thing. It's just like not having enough gas pumps to fill the cars. In Europe, it's slightly better. We had a 1 to 4 ratio in 2011, and now we're up to 1 to 11. But it's not sustainable right now. It's not sustainable. We need more chargers.
You mentioned you have a charger at home. So I have a EV in Ireland as well, and I don't think I could survive if I didn't have a charger at home.
I don't think, so much water in my face. I don't think we have the network set up right now to not have chargers at home. So if you live in an apartment, if you live in a townhome, if you live somewhere where you can't install a charger, and chargers aren't free. You can't just put the charger in. You have to get an electrician to come in. Generally, you're going to have to upgrade your electric panel. So it's $2,500 to $4,000 to do that. But we've got some different types of charging stations out in the wild. So we've got this really large number for public charging stations. If we look at those, not all of those are the same. So we've got a lot of level 2 chargers, then we've got the DC fast chargers. Those level 2 chargers, those are the kind of chargers you plug in and you get charged overnight. Maybe you go in and you eat a meal in a restaurant or you do something else. And you had 10 or 15, 20 miles maybe to your car, depending on the size of your battery. It's not something that's going to let you go on with the trip. It's not something that's going to change the day. But if you're at work and you can charge all day while you're at work or overnight, you can plug into one of those. And that's absolutely sufficient. Then we've got the DC fast chargers. And this is really where I see the challenges. So the NACS chargers, those are the Tesla chargers. Those are Tesla superchargers. Those work really well. They're highly reliable. But we only got about 25,800. Those are great, but imagine only having 28,000 gas pumps out in the United States. That's just not really sustainable. People would go crazy.
Normalize that data. I was looking at how many gas pumps are there in the United States. And I think EV adoption, people are looking for, certainly in the United States and to some extent Europe as well, but people are looking for a common experience between what they have with their with their ICE vehicle and what they would have with an electric vehicle. In the United States, just because the data was there's 150,000 gas stations throughout the United States, equating to somewhere in the neighborhood of 900,000 to 1.8 million gas pumps. And here we're talking about 25,000 chargers. So clearly not the same experience as a gas vehicle.
And those are the Tesla superchargers. All the other OEMs that are selling vehicles, selling EVs, rely on the 15,000 non-Tesla chargers because it's a different plug right now.
Right.
And it's a plug where those chargers are often broken. And we've made a decision as an industry to move in the United States to the NACS standard, which is great and will be very helpful. But so there's just not enough capacity out in the wild. So if we look at what might be preventing that from expanding, the U.S. government in 2021 did something pretty amazing, and we all thought this was going to be great. they appropriated $7.5 billion to fund more chargers. $7.5 billion should fund 25,000 chargers out there, which would be phenomenal. That would be a good boost, and that would really help to speed up the acceleration of EVs. We get to January 2022, and 0 chargers have been built, but we've now sold 863,000 EVs. So we're selling EVs, but we still don't have a real change in chargers. So this depends on people that are going to put chargers in their home. We get to January 2023, we've got 2 million EVs that we sold in the United States, and we've still built 0 chargers with this federal money. We get into January 24, we sold 2.3 million EVs in the US. So it's slowing down, and we've still built 0 chargers. So why is it slowing down? I think it's slowing down because we've overcome the supply crunch. So EVs were widely available when we couldn't buy cars and there was the huge pressure. So we were able to buy those vehicles. But consumers right now are pausing, they're waiting, they're looking. So if we look now to date, we've built 38 chargers across 7 stations with that $7.5 billion. It's become a political issue. It's a red-blue issue. The states have control here. It does take time to permit and roll out these chargers, but Tesla's able to get these done. They're the supercharger team that Elon Musk disbanded last week and then pulled back in this week really was effective at getting this done. And we need to find some other way to get chargers out there. Chargers are a constraint right now, and until we get these chargers in place, we're going to see problems. But the question then is, if we get all these chargers at place and we change from gas to electric, can the grid handle it, Wade?
Yeah. What have we looked at so far? We've touched on the EV sales slowing down, hybrid sales picking up substantially. We've discussed the hurdles that OEMs need to address for EV sales. So sticker price parity, I should say, sufficient charging infrastructure, fast and functional charging infrastructure. And so let's look at the grid a little bit. Will we be able to sustain all these EVs on the road if we were to reach the targets? In the U.S., we know that the grid is fragile and old. We have the data to say that. In Europe, it's expensive. And there are some countries like Germany that have taken their nuclear power completely offline. So this will be a key place for automakers and suppliers to lobby to not hit a failure plateau.
And the grid's fragile in Europe as well. It's just not as fragile as it is in the U.S. Right. Here in the U.S., I remember back to the 20 blackout in the Northeast, and that was really telling. We've done some upgrades since then, but there's still a lot of delicacy in the grid. It's fragile. It's not as robust as we want it to be. 40% of the grid is going to be antiquated and needs to be replaced in the next 10 years. So there's a lot of investment in infrastructure as it grows that needs to happen. And we've got places like Georgia and Virginia where we've got massive amounts of power demand coming online for AI data centers. So we're all so dependent on the internet, and everybody's talking about AI. We want to use it in cars. We want to have self-driving. We want to have all these things happen. A lot of that functionality right now is dependent on things in these big data centers, and those data centers just suck energy. So we're seeing huge investments in the semiconductor space. We're seeing lots of people focusing on AI. If you look at what's driving the stock market right now, AI stocks, chip stocks are going through the roof. And that requires a lot of power. And that power need is going to compete with the ability to put EV load on the grid and into the network.
Yeah, and even given irrespective of the EV load and the data center loads and the AI and that kind of thing that you're talking about, the infrastructures in North America, and at least Germany, which we have on this chart, if not all of Europe, is inadequate to keep up with the demand required. Obviously, investment and change in infrastructure strategy is going to be required. Lots of investment will be required.
And the OEMs have a huge opportunity here to help with this. And we've got vehicle to grid power storage. And if we can start to roll more of that out, if we can really become a partner, there's a great way to accelerate this, give consumers a way to save money if they have time of use plans at their house, and drive some good things. So there are ways that the OEMs can change the technical architecture of the cars and make these cars even more valuable and give them a new use for consumers to offset some of the price. Wouldn't it be nice if you could use your car rather than having to have a generator that came online when you had a blackout?
And in some cases they can. We like the F-150 Lightning, that was one of the major marketing points, was that you can do that.
And Hyundai Kia has now announced that they're going to have a vehicle to grid in the U.S. coming this year. So it's really coming out now.
Right.
And that's interesting and exciting.
Right. You can see from the charts here, though, historically, in the U.S., for example, we've installed capacity at a compounded annual growth rate of around 2.5% of capacity. But based on the projections through 2050, we're seeing a compounded annual growth rate of 4%. In Germany, it's even it's even worse, and it's more heavily impacted by EV.
So what do you need to build grids? We need some minerals. So copper is key. Copper is key for EVs. Copper is key for grids. So what we're looking at here, mineral demand on the left-hand chart, we're seeing massive increases in mineral demand. Copper prices have increased significantly, and we're seeing demand increasing significantly over the next 20 years. For manganese, that's a much larger increase. These are minerals that are mostly controlled by the Chinese. The Belt and Road program really enabled them to go out to get mines, to get processing capability. And that's why there's a big focus on tariffs for the minerals. We also, there's some stories there's a story that came out about Apple buying conflict minerals. So they were sourced in Rwanda. They were very, very challenged. And when you look at these minerals coming out of zones in the DRC going across to Rwanda, there's a real challenge there that we see. There's risk for the OEMs that they may also get caught up in some of this. I think everyone's trying to do all that they can do, but that's what we have. So let's look at avoiding raw mineral and raw material bottlenecks. It's going to require a combination of market developments, government intervention, and swift actions. We need the OEMs to have some proactive strategies. We're seeing some long-term agreements coming in place where the OEMs are contracting directly with miners. There are some examples where some U.S. OEMs have made investment partnerships and done prepays to secure minerals from there. We're seeing more partnerships with other mineral suppliers, and we're seeing vertical integration and strategic acquisitions of components and companies within the mineral supply base. So there's more to come there. And we need to see more production and processing capability coming out of the U.S., Europe, and Australia.
So we put a couple of slides in our deck here to talk a little bit about fuel cells and hydrogen vehicles because our practice has been asked recently about it on our thoughts. So we're not going to talk about this in great detail, but we'll give you what Seraph believes to be the punchline. So a lot of companies are investing in that. You can see those on the right, some OEMs and even some suppliers. And it seems to be a viable solution for long-haul trucking in many cases. But from the data that we've collected, you can see on the left there, the projections of hydrogen vehicles. We put on the slide here, annual projection attainment, highly unlikely. I would suggest to you, and I think Seraph would suggest to you, not going to happen, not possible. And there's primarily because if you look at the grid for hydrogen, we just talked about the challenges with the EV grid, and we've made an all concerted effort to transition to EV and the challenges associated with that. If you look in the United States, there's 107 stations, all of which seem to be on the coast, except for you got one out in the middle of Colorado. But in Europe, a little bit better, but a little bit more density, but still not to the level that you would expect to compete with a gas or even electric vehicle. Additionally, if you look in Europe, the equivalent for hydrogen for a fuel cell vehicle is a Euro 77 per liter, which is somewhat equivalent to, not too far off from a petrol vehicle with a nice engine. But if you look in the U.S., in California, the equivalent would be $14.80 a gallon. So for our European colleagues, it's in California is one of the most expensive gas states in the United States, and it's probably somewhere $5 a gallon,
and $5 to $6 a gallon. But $14.80 would be.
But 14 is prohibitive.
And a lot of it is when we look at hydrogen right now, we're using natural gas and we're using electricity to convert to hydrogen. This isn't something that's sustainable, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And with the lack of capex right now, I don't know how we're going to get there.
Yeah. So our view is that fuel cells, while it is interesting and there's some legs to it, it's a long time coming. With the limited
for passenger cars.
For passenger cars, I'm sorry. With limited investment dollars available, that's not the place to invest at the moment.
And we're happy to talk more about that with any suppliers or OEMs that are interested. We've got a lot more research on that topic, but yeah, we're not going to go into it much more here.
Yeah. All right. So suppliers. So we'll move on to the next agenda item and talk a little bit about suppliers. Not too many slides here because we've talked a lot about it from a financial perspective and EV adoption and capitalization and some of those kind of things. But some of the key things that we're seeing, key trends. So you see the powertrain uncertainty. None of this slide's going to be a surprise as it's really a summary of what we've already discussed. But the EV, ICE, hybrid, fuel cell, all that uncertainty won't be solved in this short time, like in the next year or two. At the same time, Chinese dominance in automotive production now and in the resulting global trade policies will exacerbate that powertrain uncertainty, as well as global footprints. And we're going to talk a little bit about global footprints as part of our adapting to the road ahead. In general, global unemployment, if you look at human capital is in developed regions, at least, is fairly low, causing talent shortages and labor inflation. And our practice has seen over the past few decades, actually, a shift in our human resources department missions. Past few decades, we've moved from a people developer department to a cost management and risk management missions of human resources departments. And I think it's important that we start to shift that back a little bit. As we've discussed already, the financial constraints facing suppliers, that on the bottom right there, but we've already talked quite a bit about that. And suppliers are struggling with margins on average, and we can expect that we're going to see some bankruptcies as a result of the debt situations and those kind of.
And a lot more hard discussions with the OEMs. That Airbus case is very interesting, and that takes me back to some of the discussions that I'm hearing in the U.S., and they're starting to occur in Europe, where suppliers are going into the OEMs and saying, we're running at 25 or 50% of the installed capacity. You made us capacitized for this. We've capitalized based on this. The amortized price is based on this, and we need more to cover our costs. It's just not sustainable.
In Europe, I get contacted a lot from OEMs saying, hey, I need your help validating the claims that we're seeing from suppliers. So it's prevalent.
And here we're working on developing the claims and the cost cases so there's an independent source to give to the OEM. So everyone is very focused on what's it supposed to cost, how can we do this, and how can we fairly get what we should be getting.
That's right. So with all that uncertainty, obviously, variation causes uncertainty. And with all that uncertainty, one of the things we have to look at is launches. Because if you're a supplier and you're moving or you're in series production and you've got a launch coming up, that takes investment and also causes variation or uncertainty in your business, lack of stability. And so what we see on this slide with launch loads is this particular year, there's a 40% increase in launches in Europe. But generally, the launch load seems to be higher in Europe across the years here through 2027. In North America, it's a little bit more steady increasing, but that means that there are a lot of launches. With those launches come a lot of uncertainty and investment, and therefore have to be taken very seriously.
So wait, here seeing here in the U.S., we're seeing on the launch side more delays, more challenges as they go. Engineers have been pulled. They're firefighting and manufacturing challenges right now. There's this vicious cycle of rework that's going on, and we're going to see a lot of different things happen. But I think from a new product development and introduction perspective, there is this cycle where we don't have enough engineering talent to get these products launched, and we're having early failures with PV testing. PPAPs aren't there. There's a lot of work that we've delayed and that we're behind on, and we need to see more engagement early in those processes. Suppliers have let some things slip down the road, and they're trying to recover it themselves. It's a hard road to fight right now, and then there's not a lot of skill out there to cover it.
And we're also seeing a lot of reevaluating their launches. Mercedes just announced this week that they're dropping a couple of their launches from an EV perspective to focus on the EV product that they already have in the market and some of their ICE vehicles. As we do periodically, we have asked industry leaders what their most impactful activities and challenges are. And so this slide gives a little bit of operational and commercial perspectives on some of the most effective activities that we've seen improving margins. So operationally, it's about operator turnover and aspects of OEE. And commercially, nothing's really considered ultra effective. You can see that the top one is only 30%, says very effective. But the highest scores were renegotiating with suppliers and customers and restructuring. Increase in prices to customers has been effective in our experience. And I think Adam reiterated some of that to some extent. But the risk to do that, obviously, is risk to follow on business and relationships with customers and those kind of things. So got to do that with eyes wide open. So let's talk about going forward. So we've talked about some macro issues in the industry that many on this call are going to do little about. Infrastructure issues, powertrain uncertainties in the market, EV charging networks, and the like. A lot of those may seem uncontrollable. So we want to bring it back to what is controllable. Knowing the landscape, including its uncertainties and planning, is crucial. Beyond that, there are some tactical items that we believe are most impactful, improving margin and weathering the variation. You see those on this screen, and we'll talk about each one of them a little bit in detail. Operational footprint optimization, a strong strategy to support mitigating many of the challenges. It's a good footprint strategy. We've seen that Mexico is a prime target for manufacturing as we start some reshoring, I should say, from China. And the U.S., as the U.S. addresses that China threat, they're moving production to Mexico and to the U.S. the U.S. is number two there. So bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. is also a strategy that's being employed.
And Mexico's fairly tapped out. Labor is short there. Skilled labor is short. We've even got one supplier right now that's trying to move more into a plant that they have, and they can't get the power to do it. So we're going to see more come into the U.S. and we're going to look more broadly. I think we've developed Mexico as a local, low-cost manufacturing power, but it's at its limit.
Right. It's getting pretty tapped out. In Europe, you can see some of the European responses here. This is coming from our leader survey. In Europe, they're doing the same thing, although a little bit to a lesser extent. With the recent tariffs being announced in the U.S. and Europe looking at similar moves, we should expect all this to increase.
And we think that suppliers need to be looking very closely at where their supply is in light of the tariffs. If there is a tariff that's placed on China more broadly for automotive parts, you need to have a plan to do something to move, to have the ability to source outside of China. We think there's a high probability that will happen. We were all surprised by the pandemic, even though we knew there was a potential for a pandemic to happen. There's a high likelihood that we will see a tariff on components coming out of China, and that will be very impactful for all of us.
And then for cash, when in most cases, you always look at capital expenses and inventory. Obviously, you got launches coming up, so capital, we're going to have to free up some capital for those launches. So capital's already been limited in the industry, and debt to capitalize is more difficult to get by many suppliers on average. But regarding inventory, most are looking at their supply chain, and the quick fix is to add inventory to insulate production floors from long supply chains or black swan events or China dependence or whatever. As a result, we've seen a significant reduction in inventory turns, as you can see on the left, most severely in Europe. Many would say that in the face of supply chain resilience initiatives, that reducing inventory in some cases is dangerous. But our experience tells us that there are some strategies to employ that can help. Things like speeding the flow of production to reducing lead times, vetting suppliers better. And what we mean by that is doing, not just looking at the low cost, but looking at the total picture. Or customers, consigned inventory, I should say, from suppliers or customers are some of those strategies. But having a command of the supply chain status at the bottom there, real-time data monitoring, command of the supply chain status, and we've seen that as to be the strongest of the initiatives. Improving the visibility of the supply chain all the way through allows for elimination of surprises and allows for reacting to potential issues.
So we rolled out Production Net across some different places, and Production Net is a tool that we use to monitor the supply chain and to monitor production on the shop floor. We're seeing that there are levers that can be pulled. We're seeing that improvements can be made, but it's really hard. And that it focuses on what OEE is and how do we get better OEE. We want to figure out how do we reduce downtime, how do we improve quality, and how do we improve consistency coming out of the lines and let everybody know when there's a blip in the supply chain where that blip is. Right. Figuring that out is critical, and figuring out early is critical.
Right. So OEE, you mentioned OEE. OEE is one of the areas that has the highest impact on improving margins. We're surprised at how low OEE is in many of the plants that we do assessment. We do hundreds of assessments of different facilities, and we're always surprised at how low a lot of the OEEs are. In many cases, companies plan for 85, 90% OEE in some cases, and during the launch phase of a project, for example. But the equipment they're running on the floor that's common with that launch are running 50, 55% at best. And strong strategies to measure and improve that OEE quickly is a must for production management. In our experience, the strongest opportunities are through a shop floor-led culture and execution of production fundamentals, both of which we wrap into what we call our managing daily improvement processes that Seraph has, and using data wisely. Ambrose mentioned our Production Net software, which helps gather that data in a very quick way and turn it into meaningful knowledge that makes it very actionable. Human capital. So in order to sustain those kind of improvements, human capital is important. So human capital issues have increased since the pandemic. We've talked about labor inflation. We've talked about labor shortages.
And retirements are there. And we've got a lot of retirements that have aged and in place. Human resources hasn't developed the next generation. Succession plans aren't in place. We've got maintenance people that are retiring en masse. We've got senior leadership in plants that are starting to retire. They've saved enough money. The markets have done well. They're ready to go. They're done with fighting the fight. And we haven't developed that next generation of leader. So as we look across this more broadly, as we go in and do assessments, we see these problems time and time again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so you see that on the left, the respondents to our leader survey tell us that labor acquisition is still very difficult. Most all the specialties have seen a deficit in available candidates and a struggle to hire is significant. There are things that can be done to help them. With all the assessment that we do in factories, we include an assessment of the organization. In many cases, actually structure is a significant concern versus simply not having talent. Making sure that employees are clear on the mission, their contribution to that mission is clear, and having accountability mechanisms and incentives to accomplish their KPIs goes a long way toward attracting and retaining talent. I mentioned previously about the HR functions have seemed to migrate from people developers to cost management or risk management arms, and I think we have to adjust those priorities a little bit, especially given the new crop of employees coming into the workforce now from different generations that have high expectations that employers are going to have to meet.
Yeah, and then we need to do things differently. We need to recruit differently. We need to try to source our employees differently. We need to gamify the manufacturing floor so that people are incentivized and find some way to connect to what they're doing. Manufacturing, we need to make manufacturing sexy. It's not sexy right now. We need to find a way to get the youth to want to get into manufacturing, and that's a real challenge for senior executives as well as the HR team. How do we make this a place that people want to work? Because we can't make our industry, if we can't make automotive the place that people want to work, we're in trouble. And I think there are some real tools and real ways that we can move that forward. And part of that is by really focusing on a shop floor culture to enable everyone to be connected and feel like a team, because that team environment resonates with everyone.
In some cases, we may actually have to move facilities to places that have the talent required to operate. So what we've seen over the years is some plants are in places that don't have a talent pool to support the plants that they once did, or plants have grown beyond the level that an area can support the talent. So refer back to the footprint analysis that we talked about a few slides ago.
And we go in and we do assessments for clients that are struggling to figure out if we can't find resources. There are always ways to figure out and solve the human capital problem. Some are short-term fixes, and then you have to have a long-term fix placed on top of it, which might be moved to a different location or transfer some lines out. There are a lot of different levers that can be pulled, but we just need to understand which levers can be pulled and how we can pull them effectively. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar. Hopefully it's been valuable for you. If there are any questions, we can take a few minutes. We're out of time right now, but we can take a few minutes and answer questions if you have any.
Yeah, we've got one question coming in. Bonvetti at Luxit Group, he was saying, what do you think the impact from the upcoming U.S. presidential election will have on our industry?
Well, I think that's a great question. It really depends on, I would have said on Monday, I would have told you it depends on who wins, but I think we're heading down a path where regardless of who wins, we're going to see increased tariffs. I think there's a huge acknowledgement that and I'm going to get into geopolitics here, so I apologize. We're going to see, for a national security reason, investment in the auto industry. It's strategically important. If we look back to World War II, automotive plants were what was converted to make tanks and planes. So there's an acknowledgement within, I think, both administrations that we need to support this industry, and tariffs coming in on Chinese product coming into the country, and specifically Chinese auto parts coming into the country, are expected. And we think that we'll either get that from the Biden administration shortly before the election to bolster their ability to win, or we'll see it come in from Trump very quickly after he takes office to happen. And it could come in from both. So we could see an increase from Biden, and then if Trump happens to win, we could see a further increase on automotive components. We need to be prepared for that. Right now, we don't have suppliers that can produce all of these parts here in the U.S. So we have to understand what's the impact on pricing and how do we deal with that. It's a great question.
Yeah, I think there's another question here on battery supply chains and the reliance on China currently and what can be done in the medium term.
So I think we're seeing a lot of different battery manufacturers coming into the U.S. As some of you may know, I'm doing some work in the DRC, so we're actually advising mining operations now, and we're understanding from a mineral perspective what can be done, how can we get more. The Chinese dominate Africa, and they dominate the raw mineral space. For mining, I'm just going to take the DRC as a specific example. About 90% of the operations there are controlled by China in one way, shape, or form. A lot of ore that's pulled out of the ground is actually loaded up on boats, moves to China, bunches processed there. So how do we move it back here? I think there needs to be more strategic investment made. And I hate to say this, but strategic investment by the government. I hate government subsidies. I would love to let private industry function, let the free markets reign. But right now we're dealing with a Chinese government that has heavily subsidized, and we need to, in order to compete with that, get some subsidies out of the West in order to facilitate and drive that forward. So we need to continue to lobby, we need to continue to push, and we need to focus on making sure that we have the processing capabilities and we're able to pull the minerals more directly from Africa and prevent them from going to China so that we can avoid the tariffs and support companies and private industry that's trying to get more involved in the mining and processing of these minerals for the batteries. And then I think we also want to look at the refining. Redwood Industries, J.B. Straubel's company, is really looking at how do we recycle. I think we're very early days of recycling batteries, but we've got a lot of batteries that are beginning to age out, some of the early EVs. Now they're less efficient, but they still have a lot of lithium, a lot of cobalt, a lot of other minerals in that we can reclaim. So if we can find a way to effectively extract those minerals, and as scarcity rises, as costs go up, there's more incentive to learn how to cost effectively refine, recapture, recycle that particular content. So I think we'll see more of that going on as well.
And I think from a European perspective, the answer is somewhat similar, although I would say from a recycling, you mentioned recycling. So with the European Commission and their battery passport, the base project doing the battery passport, there's a lot more activity going on, I'm finding out, in Europe than there is in the US in recycling batteries. And so reclaiming a lot of those elements is helpful.
I think there's also going to be a real focus on understanding truly where the minerals are coming from. The article that came out on Apple, the court case has been filed against Apple for allegedly sourcing minerals with content that wasn't appropriate, is key. And I don't think any of the automotive companies want to have that happen. So taking a good hard look at how you can prevent that is critical. We're having some conversations with partners right now on that particular topic, and it's a hot topic. It's one that no one really wants to talk about, but it's one that we need to talk about, and we need to have a plan, because the last thing we want to do is to be accused of having conflict minerals in our batteries.
Another question that's coming in about your opinion on car sharing and micromobility, which I know was a hot topic a few years ago, and I might add on top of that, that there was definitely a thought about that influencing car demand. Do you have any kind of thoughts on if those are going to materialize?
I think car sharing has its purpose and its use. I think we're seeing more, and we're still seeing that out there. Rental car fleets have finally been replenished to levels where you can actually rent a rental car at the airport. I think car sharing services like Turo and others are out there, and we're seeing some of that. There was a big push towards self-driving and a technology shift. I would love to say that we see cars being autonomous in the near future. We don't. We see great technologies out there. There's some phenomenal LiDAR technology, camera technology is improving, and a lot of that can really help us get to lower accidents, less death on the road. But I think we're still a ways out from having the processing power and the capabilities to have autonomous driving. Tesla has some great tools out there. I was lucky enough to play with their latest beta autonomous software, and it was pretty good. It actually drove me from point A to point B. I was a bit nervous, but I've been hearing about autonomous driving coming for some time. I think when we get to fully autonomous driving, we'll see another shift, and we'll see more car sharing, and that will support higher prices because you'll be able to put your car to work for you when you're not driving it. But I think we're a ways off from that. So I think there is some need for car sharing. People want to do it. I think there may be more of a need in Europe than there is in the US, and even more acceptance in Europe than in the US. But I don't think it's going away anytime soon, but I don't think it's going to expand.
Yeah. Car sharing in Europe actually is much more prevalent. There are cars spread around Dublin, for example, and it's in the major cities, I would say, but spread around Dublin where you have an app and you just go pick up the car and use it and drop it off wherever you're at, kind of thing, almost like a scooter. And it's more prevalent. But the question was, will it impact volumes going forward? I would suggest to you the market for a car sharing consumer is probably different than those that would buy a car. So of course it's another option, therefore it'll have a minor impact on sales, but I don't see that being major. It's really for inner cities. A lot of people don't even own a car in a city anyways. I'm not sure that it would have a major impact.
And then for micromobility, we're seeing you've got bird scooters, you've got electric bikes, you've got other means of transport that are out there. We don't expect that to go away anytime soon, but there's a lot more pressure being put on those services by municipalities. Cities don't want scooters littering their streets or bikes falling all over the place. So we're seeing a lot more controls being put in place, and we don't think that's going to do much to hurt volumes.
Certainly not in the short term.
And we got a question from Nick at Mercedes, who is asking, what are some of the big challenges with the recent wave of nearshoring and industrialization in Mexico?
So Nick, that's a great question. I think you're seeing a lot of challenges down there. We're seeing labor shortages. We're seeing a big bubble coming into Mexico right now and a lack of skills. Supply chains are not necessarily fully shifted. So we're dealing with longer supply chains. It needs more planning. We need more logistics, PC&L skills in order to make that work. When we're being called in, that's one of the key things that we're seeing. There's a shortage in skills there. Maintenance personnel seem to also be in short supply. So we get these things installed. Integrators are running behind in terms of having equipment ready to launch on the shop floor. And the engineering on some of the products as they transfer it, we're seeing a lot of people that relied on tribal knowledge and the plant where parts were being manufactured as they move into Mexico. That tribal knowledge isn't necessarily transferring. So there are a lot of bumps in the road. We expect a lot of those to clear. But we're going to see more challenges with products coming out of Mexico. A lot of our business for the first part of the year has been doing crisis work in Mexico, and we expect that to continue. And we're seeing more demand. About 2/3 of the demand this year is coming from Mexico, which is unique.
I've worked with Mexico for 30 years, and they have come a really long way with regard to skilled labor and collar, blue collar, whatever different labor force. They made huge investment in being able to meet up to the challenge. The problem is that the glut of production that's come into Mexico has outpaced that. And so we're now at the point where skilled labor and some of those kind of things are just in short supply at the moment. Who got there first got all the...
And we're seeing more coming back into the U.S., and I think we're going to see other markets open up, Nick. I think we're going to see more go out of China. But I think for MUSI in particular, Mexico will continue to be a good place to source. And my recommendation is when you start to see a supplier miss a run at rate or something happens, intervene early. You want to get in there early. You want to make sure that you're addressing these issues before they become problems. We know that if we fail a PV test, if we're missing PPAPs, or if we fail a run at rate, we want to intervene. The cost of intervening early is about 1/10 of the cost of intervening after it goes to crisis.
Yeah, maybe one final question. There's some OEMs that are announcing building plants in Mexico. Do you think that's going to make more suppliers go down and move there? How do you think that's going to change the landscape?
I think we're definitely going to see more OEMs launch in Mexico. I think the UAW contracts that were put in place are historic, but they're also putting a lot of pressure on wages. And those wage pressures are moving not just to the OEM plants, to that labor, but it's impacting the suppliers. So the costs are going up across the board. Mexico does have lower cost labor. There is some labor available. If you go to the south of Mexico, it's not really industrialized yet, but it's coming. So we're going to see OEMs opening up there that'll result in new supply parks coming in and additional challenges as a result of that. I think we're also going to see Chinese suppliers start to move into Mexico. If I was down in Mexico recently, and there are a lot of Chinese vehicles running around the roads in Mexico. They're reliable and they're cheap, and in lower cost markets where people don't make as much money, they just can't afford to buy cars with these high sticker prices. They need alternatives. And I think we'll see plants that are serving those markets come in. The challenge is, as they develop, as they grow, and as quality improves, they're going to start to serve other markets, and they're going to be competitors for all of us. So we're not going to be able to draw a hard line at our border forever. These cars are going to come in, and we'll see increasing suppliers moving into Mexico, which I think is going to further strain the Mexico supply base, which is, I suppose, what this question is about. And as we see more labor strains and more constraints, we'll see more suppliers struggling, and they'll need intervention. They'll need outside help from the OEMs and from others.
Another situation. I was talking to a CEO in Germany who had a plant in Mexico, but he was getting some of his material from China and then processing it in Mexico and then shipping it to the U.S. And he is in the process of helping. It's one of the reasons we were talking to him. It was to redefine his supply chain. And the reason for that is it's a 7.5% tariff bring things from Mexico into the U.S. unless the origin of the material going into that is from China. And it's literally triple that. So it's 22.5%, which obviously changes the business case substantially.
And what if that goes to 60%?
And what if that goes to 60%?
Or 100%?
Exactly.
And I think the one thing that we know is tariffs are now coming. We've seen the warning shot. I would encourage everyone to look at their supply chains to really understand what's going into ICE vehicles, hybrids, EVs, look at projections, look at volumes, have some dynamics and some sensitivities in your models so that you can adjust those, and look at what's coming from China, put in sensitivities, understand where you are positioned if we get a 25% or a 60% or 100% tariff on some of those components. We thank you all very much for joining this webinar. It's been great talking to you. We're happy to have as many discussions as you want to have offline. Our emails are up here. Feel free to reach out to myself, to reach out to Wade, to send a comment, question. We'll continue to monitor the comments and questions, and we'll respond to people individually. We know there are a bunch more questions on here, and we'll get back to all of you. Thank you all very much. We enjoyed talking today. Please let us know if this was valuable. Please let us know what else you'd like to see us talk about, and we look forward to talking to you all soon.
Thank you for your time today.
Take care.